My name's Corey Hulen. I'm a co-founder and CTO of Mattermost, and I'm going to talk about lessons learned building software with a fully remote team. So, why do we build a fully remote development team in the first place? For us, this really comes down to kind of two things. So, if anyone knows anything about Mattermost, we're kind of two things in one. We're an open source project, and we're also a company. And so, when we went through this process of building our company, a large part of our community is all around the world, right? So for us, it made a lot of sense as a company to be all around the world. A large part of our customer base is all around the world. So as a company as well, it made a lot of sense to sort of be open to hiring all around the world. And so for us, those are two sort of really big sort of motivations for doing this. Coming from an open source project, wanting to have access to people all around the world, wanting to have our customers have access to people all around the world too, kind of is where we kind of came about this, being available in all time zones. I always like to say, software is not bound by location. It's the weirdest thing in our industry, right? We sort of congregate around these hubs like Silicon Valley, but it's not like we show up to an oil rig or a diamond mine in Canada or whatever. It's not like there's a physical reason why we have to be in these places. There's historical reasons because people move there for jobs or whatever, and it kind of became the central place where people moved. But with today's technology, with things like video conferencing or messaging, there's no reason why you have to physically sit in the same place. The other thing for us is we build communication software. So if you're not familiar with Mattermost, we're basically a persistent message application, persistent chat. It's a system we build. It's a great way to stay connected. Some of the things that we do is we actually dog food our own server. So what's really interesting, community.mattermost.com is where our community sits. Anyone can go join that server. Community Daily is just a variant of that. That's actually a daily build. We have 6,000 plus community who sit there and about 100 staff members. So we interact on this server through all time zones throughout the day, interacting with 6,000 community members and over 100 staff members. So it gave us a great way to sort of dog food our own system as well. So what are some of the benefits of fully remote development teams? Probably the first biggest one for us is just a vast sea of resources. Being able to recruit from that vast sea is a really big motivation. We want to recruit people who are mission driven, and to recruit people who are mission driven, you kind of have to go to where they are. If you're a really big company, you can probably attract talent in, but what we find is, especially being an open source project, is you want to find people who believe in that work, and when they believe in that work, attracting them to your company. And so for us, those are some of the really big benefits of doing it, is being able to find very meaningful people anywhere in the world, and recruiting from those places around the world. Some other interesting benefits, we can respond in time zones that our customers are in. It's a great benefit. Also, just keeping systems up and running is another thing. People do different systems, like follow the sun in terms of support. Even when we were a really small company, we had that intrinsically in our system. So our community serves a great example. We dog food it. We would have, when we hired our first European person, I lived on the West Coast. If the system went down, he would have fixed it in the middle of the night. So you get that kind of great sort of all around the world mentality. Now we're more than 100 staff all around the world, and it's just a great way to support customers, to support the community. When something's going on in the middle of the night, you don't necessarily have to worry about it. You don't necessarily have to worry about it. People become empowered by our trust in them. So being fully remote, you end up with this weird situation where what time do you show up at work? You don't have that external peer pressure of a boss hovering over your shoulder telling you when to do. So it creates a very high trust environment where we trust in the employees to do the right thing, and the employee trusts in the company as well. And so it self-selects these highly individually motivated people. And so for us, that's another really big benefit, is just the people you attract to this type of lifestyle can be very advantageous because they typically tend to be very self-motivated, can get the job done with very little interaction, stuff like that. We offer a digital nomad lifestyle that only some people can dream about. So one of the interesting things for our company is if you submit a pull request to our open source project, we ship you this mug. We kind of have this running joke between our community and staff of take a picture of the mug all around the world or wherever you've been. These are all pictures actually from me. So I was sort of the poster child for this lifestyle for a while. I spent 2 summers in Alaska and 2 winters in Florida and kind of everywhere else in between. And so it was a really great experience for a couple years there where I had a very nomadic lifestyle. I'd be working on the road, helping build and support the product. I have a bunch of funny stories. Probably one of the more interesting ones is when I was heading up to Alaska, out in the middle of nowhere, I get a cell phone signal, my phone starts going off. One of our customers, a very large electric car manufacturer, is having some issues. So I pull off onto the side of the road. I got my family in tow in an RV, and I'm sitting there out in the middle of Alaska, pop up my laptop, go to work. My kids go off and start playing out in the middle of Alaska. I'm kind of like freaking out, like, got to take care of the customer, but I don't want my kids to get eaten by a bear. Like, what's going on? And so it lends itself really interesting to this kind of lifestyle. And if you have at least in our company, if you have a cell phone signal or some sort of internet connection, you kind of work from anywhere. And so it's a very fun lifestyle, fulfilling lifestyle. There's always some drawbacks. So what are some of the drawbacks of being fully remote? Hiring in all time zones. So it's not easy, right? It requires a lot of support. It requires a lot of finance, a lot of recruiting, a lot of things like HR and stuff to support you in all these different countries and different areas. Knocking on a closed door is extremely hard. Knocking on a virtual door is even harder. So I'll talk about some of the strategies as we go through to kind of break down the barriers of that virtual door. This one is actually kind of changing, but I would say potential investors and customers think it's weird. We've been doing sort of fully remote for the last 5, almost 6 years now. So definitely when we started, it was very taboo. I think today that's changing a lot, even more recently with all the coronavirus stuff going on, it's changing rapidly. But I think that's always an interesting one. Even investors, I think, in our early on, were very nervous of this style company. I think today it's pretty normal, and so it's not that big of a deal. And then the other thing you always kind of get is like that, who's in the office right now, right? Do not disturb, whatever it is, always trying to bug somebody. So some other drawbacks is just, we're humans at the end of the day. You still require that face-to-face time. I'm an introverted person, but one thing we realize as a company is you still got to kind of get everyone together, just kind of get that face time. You got to build those bonds. And so the way we do it is we kind of do it through 2 different mechanisms. We have one called Mattercon, where we fly in the entire company and their significant others out to an area. We just got back from the Bahamas a couple weeks ago. Before that, we went to Punta Cana, we went to Lisbon, Vegas. So this is where we kind of get the company together once a year. So we try really hard every year to bring the entire company together. And then what we allow the feature teams to do, so in our organization, feature teams, or pods, however you want to describe them, they're kind of full stack teams. We try to make them geographic, or at least time zone based, and we try to let those teams get together 1 to 3 times a year. They get to decide, but they get to choose where they want to go. So a feature team for us typically looks like an engineering lead, maybe 5 engineers. They'll have a QA, they'll have a designer, they'll have a product manager, or some combination of those things. So usually between like 6 and 10 people. We'll let them organize their own little feature meetups where they kind of get together, and they get together for anywhere from 3 to 5 days, hang out together and work. And we let them do that 1 to 3 times a year. Most teams choose to do it only once a year opposite Mattercon, so they're getting together at least twice a year. Some teams do it 2 or 3 times a year, and they'll get together in shorter increments closer together. So it really depends on the geographic distribution of the teams. Like I said, we try to keep our teams within the same time zone. Doesn't always work out. Some teams are really fortunate in the sense that they are kind of from a greater area, so they're all within 2 to 5 hours travel distance of each other, so it's a lot easier to get them together. Some of our teams, unfortunately, are a lot farther apart in the sense that they're in the same time zone, but somebody might live down in South America. And so getting them up or getting people down there for a feature team meetup can be a little challenging. But we realize, that sort of face-to-face time is one of those drawbacks, and you have to have ways to combat that. So what does good communication look like? Here's some of the good communication stuff that we run through. An organization has to really value asynchronous written form communication. If you want to build a remote work culture, I think that's one of the first things you kind of have to have. We're very fortunate. We build a product that does that. So I think as a culture, as a body of people, as a body of community, as a body of staff, we're really good at that sort of mentality. We're really good at the mentality of you need to write everything down. We do it for 2 reasons. 1, because being a fully remote company, you need to write everything down. But 2, because we're also an open source project, we find writing all that information down for our community is very valuable. So you have that kind of classic example of, less than 1% of, we have 6,000 people sitting in our community server, probably less than 1% of them, or let's say less than 10% of them are active any given day or week or whatever. Active in the sense that they're information producers, right? They're very active in the sense that they're information consumers. So we've trained our staff members to be very good about being, about asynchronously communicating, even if it sounds like or feels like you're speaking to an empty room sometimes. So we'll teach people to go into channels, start talking about subjects, and this is more probably from our sort of open source community roots or whatever, but start having conversations with yourself about this is what we're gonna do, this is what it is, and then the community sort of filters into the channel and kind of sees what's going on. Some of the other things we do, we're really good at things like ephemeral video. So it's still a very powerful form of communication, but we're really good about when we drop into ephemeral video, we're really good about taking copious amounts of notes and posting them back into a channel somewhere. And you can experience this or see this examples of this on our community server. You'll see a bunch of devs sitting in a room, having discussions asynchronously in a channel. It'll kind of over time, or over that short period of time, it'll break down to like, hey, let's just get together in a Zoom call or a video call real quick and talk this through. And they'll go off into a Zoom call. They'll kind of talk it through, and then they'll take copious amounts of notes and they'll post it back into the channel as like, hey, here's a summary of what we discussed in that meeting. Because A, there's community members who may not have joined the video call, or B, there just may be other staff members or employees who are at different time zones who are not online at that time, and they still come into the channel after the fact. They see the conversation. They want to catch up on like, okay, well, what's the decisions you guys made in that video call? We're very anti-meeting. We still have them. We're very mindful about it. We're very anti-reoccurring meeting as well. I would love to say that we have 0 meetings. We don't. We still have probably way more meetings than we should. But we're very conscious about, is this meeting valuable? Is it worth everybody's time? It can be really hard for people in certain time zones to make certain meetings. We're getting better at trying to balance meetings like twice a day or whatever, or different times. Some of the other interesting things we do, we're very anti-reoccurring meeting as well. Our firm belief is that anything that can be happening in a meeting can probably be discussed asynchronously. So let's start with that mentality first. When I say anti-reoccurring meetings, we try really hard not to schedule any reoccurring meetings on Monday or Friday. Those days, because the work weeks tend to be really hard. It's a classic, like if I schedule a meeting 10 a.m. San Francisco time, that's 6 p.m. here in London. Nobody wants to go to work at 6 p.m. on a Friday evening or whatever. And so we try really hard not to schedule recurring meetings on Mondays and Fridays. Meetings are definitely still valuable. Can't get away with it. But like I said, we try really hard to get rid of it. And we try really hard to push everything into some asynchronous mode of communication. Some of the other good, you got to be respectful of people's time zones. We have a lot of like tribal knowledge within our community and company about how we do that. Sometimes it can be certain things as like saying stuff like not urgent. So you'll see in our system lots of times people will start messaging people, or even I'll do it. I'll message someone. I know it's past whatever 5, 6 p.m. for them, so I know they're offline or they're not working. I'll say not urgent, and for us that's like a cue or a sign to say, to tell the individual or the group of people working on the issue, like, hey, this is an urgent, your next business day. So whenever you wake up and you come into work, work through this issue or work through this thing. So we have a lot of little sort of tribal knowledge tales that kind of help with those types of things. Simulated water cooler time, that's the question I always get asked. Corey, what about brainstorming and water cooler time and all that kind of stuff? We have it, it's just different. In our world, it's a lot more forced, but it's still just as effective. We do things like scheduled audio hangouts, so audio-only hangouts, where we have optional blocks of meetings where if you just want to join, you want to join with your audio on so you can chit-chat with people while you're having lunch or programming or whatever it is, go for it. We have a lot of social channels in our chat system where we can interact on that level. Another one example is we have a weekly video game hour. So this is a Civ game that we have been playing for, 5-6 months. And we just schedule those in, right? So it's a little bit different than like your normal serendipitous water cooler time or where you go bump into somebody at the water cooler. Ours is a lot more manufactured, but it has the same outcome. You end up having a lot of the same discussions that you would have around a water cooler. The only difference is we're a lot more methodical about scheduling that kind of stuff in. Some of the good, open communication. Being an open source project, this is something we really encourage, but I think any kind of company or community would really benefit from this. We try really hard to push everything into the open, into open channels. So that way when you're discussing information, you're doing it openly, it's not locked in some channel somewhere. Anyone in the audience can kind of take advantage of that. And it allows our community and our company to interact in such a way that's really interesting. So I always like, we're an open source project, but we also have an enterprise version of our product. So one of the really interesting things that we do when you talk about the enterprise version, we actually talk about features, enterprise features publicly. We spec them publicly. We architect them publicly. We're very open around that communication. About the only thing that we don't talk about publicly is our customer base, because lots of times we're not allowed to, and then security issues. We talk about security issues after the fact or after we've already fixed them. But those are about the only two things at our company that we consider private or we don't like to talk about in public. And some of them are contractual reasons and security reasons. Actually, security stuff we'll talk about once we fix it and it's released out into the wild and we're happy with it. We'll definitely talk about it. But everything else we try to push publicly. And I think this is a great, having that open communication at a remote company. So even if you're not an open source company, even if you're not dealing with an open source community, just having very open communication within your company, having that sort of default open mentality, especially at a fully remote company, is one of the things that can go a long way as well. So what does suboptimal communication look like? So you always run into these different situations. The classic one is, hello, is anyone there? You receive a message at 3 o'clock in the morning. There's always this fear, you always hear the constant fear of you need to be online. So one of the things I try to tell people, and this is like the classic example is down here in the right. And I always try to tell people when they start at Mattermost, a new staff member starts at Mattermost, I always give them this scenario ahead of time. And I tell them, when you find yourself in this scenario, make a conscious decision to not do it. And the classic example is 7 o'clock rolls around, I'm sitting on my couch, eating dinner, watching TV, I'm not doing anything important, and bloop, 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 like I get a message like, oh, Jim wants me to do this thing or whatever. I'm not doing anything, I'm just watching TV. Let me walk back up to my office, which is, a room upstairs, sit down behind the computer, do a little bit of work. And that's one of those sort of telltale signs of sort of being drawn back in. It's one of the hardest things as a remote worker to sort of separate your sort of living life from your work life, right? There's no clear separation of going to the office. So we try really hard to tell people, like, it's one of those traps that most people fall into, but we try really hard to warn people, like, hey, when you see yourself getting into this trap, make a conscious decision to like, hey, I'm offline. And our company culture has a lot of respect for that in the sense that they know that person's probably offline. I'm not going to expect an answer till the next business day. And so as an individual, sometimes you'll feel pressure to like respond or answer these things, but we have a sort of a company culture of there's no expectation from the other side that you can respond. And we actively warn people like, hey, when you find yourself doing this, don't, right? Like, Yeah, there's always the emerging, there's always something, some exception to the rule, something going on where you got to get up in the middle of the night or do something in the middle of the night because something's broken or blowing up or whatever. But that's definitely the exception to the rule. Some of the other interesting ones, conversations can be brought back from the dead. So anyone who lives in a thread or chat-based or message-based system or lives in that sort of asynchronous lifestyle, someone will fire off a search. They'll find a subject or channel that's several months old. This is very interesting to me, like let me resurrect it from the dead. So we have that. We have ways of dealing with that sometimes. I actually suffer from this one quite a bit, which is short or terse writing can come across as like upset or angry. And so you have to be very conscious about that. I do especially too, because I'm in so many meetings. I'll be like messaging people very short or terse messages, and they'll be like, Corey's mad. I'm like, no, I was talking. I was just trying to send you something really quick. And so you have to be conscious of that. The last one is, is sort of that bad etiquette, right? At all in a channel. You're about to notify 6,000 people in 157 different time zones. So you sure you want to do this, right? It amazes me. So there's some things in the technology, the tool, even in Mattermost, that can stop you from doing this. Here's a warning. Some of the channels you can't even send if it's over a certain number of users. It won't let you do it. But it amazes me, even when it's a couple hundred, people will get this warning and they'll still click send. And, whatever, a couple hundred people will get a notification, and you can see the collective sigh of like the community and the staff members like, oh my gosh, what are you doing? Like, why did you just do that? So there's a lot of like social pressure to not do those things when they do happen. And the tool protects you from some of these as well. But it's still that kind of bad etiquette of like, hey, let me just notify everyone in this channel when you could do an @ here or notify individuals. So what tools do we use to be effective? Obviously for us, we use Mattermost. We kind of live and breathe in that tool. Our entire community runs there. Our entire company runs there. It's where we probably spend 95% of our time. We try to push everything to an asynchronous written conversation. It's just kind of how we operate as a community, as a company, but it's our number one place of go-to place. Probably our second go-to place is Zoom, right? Dropping into some sort of ephemeral video chat to sort of speed up that conversation. And then for us, there's that long tail of stuff that's kind of nice, and important to have. Things like GitHub, Jira. We use a lot of Google Docs. We want to capture something more than messages in a channel or more details that we want to carry on. So we'll capture in a Google Doc. We'll link the Google Doc into the header. So we'll do a lot of stuff like that. So when we're talking about specs or architecture diagrams, we almost always do it as a Google Doc. We'll create a channel, whatever's going on. We'll link that doc in the channel. So we do a lot of stuff like that in terms of the tools that we use. We also, we provide mics for people. We provide headsets for people. A lot of people have different sort of feelings on that. Some people love a mic and a headset. I've kind of come full circle. I went from wanting a mic and headset to now not using anything. But we have a lot of sort of personal practices around that kind of stuff as well. How do we work with customers? So this can be one of the really interesting things for us that's kind of unique. We have customers. We actually give customers, if you're a Premier Support or whatever, we give you a channel in our system. And so we'll have customers, and sometimes even our community, but they'll have direct access to engineering. And so it leads into all these amazing situations where you have really intimate access with your customers. And I kind of talked about the one example of traveling to Alaska and having to support a customer. I have another interesting one. If anyone's interested, they can come up and talk about it afterwards, where I was actually in Disney World with my family, and another one around that. So it's really interesting to sort of have this asynchronous communication lifestyle, but invite customers into it as well. And so we'll talk about things like feature development. We'll allow customers to provide feedback, and we'll also do incident response right in the channel with customers. And we'll do that all asynchronously. And it's an amazing thing to see, because even if a customer is not having an issue per se, they can go into the channel at a lot of different hours of the day, message in there, and there'll probably be somebody from the engineering staff who's in that channel at that day, at that time, message them back. So it provides a really interesting, like, Premier Support channel for our customers. What are we trying to improve? So we're constantly asking ourselves, hey, like, how can we get better at this? We've gotten a lot better at things like better at recording company meetings, team meetings. We realize, especially now that we've grown so much, being able to record those meetings and share back those recordings is a big part of what we do. Organizing smaller regional group meetups. Like I said, I think I talked about our feature team meetups. That's something we enacted in the last year, maybe. And it's really kind of taken on full steam now. Because we've always had MatterCon or get the company together. And it became, or grew to such a point where we realized you don't have that sort of intimate meeting with your team, working through issues, that kind of stuff. And so we implemented this sort of feature team mentality, and that's really worked well. Holding more office hours, something we need to get better at as well. We do it sporadically. We don't have a good methodology for doing it, but it's something we do. Understanding when people are offline is another great one. And then we're constantly asking, like, how do we break down that virtual door? How do you knock on that virtual door? That's a really hard concept to get over. We talk a lot about as a company, we talk a lot about as an engineering org, like how do we make people feel more comfortable. Some of the interesting things we do as a company, as an example that came from direct feedback, was we have Mentor for a Day. So when you first started our company, for about the first 2 weeks, you have kind of an assigned mentor who is there with you for the first 2 weeks, who you can ask questions to, whatever. But every single day of the week, you have a meeting scheduled for 30 minutes with a different person. Typically, it's people in your team or starts with people in your team, but it grows to people past your team. And it's just a forcing function to give you sort of a mentor for the day, to sit down and discuss something with someone, to interact with someone. And we always like to tell people, like, yeah, it's great to talk about technology, it's great to talk about, engineering, but don't be afraid to talk about, how's your life? Like, what do you like to do for fun? Do you like to snowboard? Do you like to ski? Just to get to know people better. And so we do stuff like that as well. Yeah. Questions? Anybody have any questions on? Yep.
Hi. Where do you keep your knowledge base? So this is like, say, documentation related to say engineering or run books or stuff like that. And because you have a global team, how do they know that, where do you keep all that?
Yeah, so for us, it's in a couple different places. We have things like our handbook, which is our, like general HR policies and stuff like that. That's actually public on the web. You can search it. It's just handbook.mattermost.com. So that's one place. We have docs@mattermost.com where we have things like playbooks or runbooks. And a lot of stuff for us is in channel as well. So we will have channels that are topic specific. There'll be like a security channel for a security incident. When a security incident is happening, the security researchers will be in that channel monitoring it or interacting with it. But at the top of the channel, we'll also have that Google Doc. And that Google Doc might have like the runbook in it, or it might have different procedures for how we handle what's going on. So that we kind of do it in those 3 different ways.
Sorry, a follow-up question to this. So that's like company-wide, but what about, say, each team sort of has to have their own bunch of documentation in their own silos? Yep. Like, how do you break that down to like other remote teams that need that knowledge base, or is there a single unified place, or is it different? You find it's all scattered all over the place.
So I wouldn't say it's scattered all over the place. Each of the different feature teams create their own channels or topics, and each of those own channels or topics have the same structure. They have the same structure in that they can be some channels that are team-based, and that team-based channel, when you go into it, at the top of the header, same thing. It'll be linked to a whole bunch of docs, and one might be a spec or design doc about that particular feature, what that feature team works on. So we always break it down in terms of channels in our system or topics in our system is how we do it. And sometimes those channels are sort of horizontal feature-based, so they'll go across several feature teams. Sometimes those channels are very vertical and specific, like to that specific feature team. We have a feature team that's called Workflow. They work specifically on incident response, management, and workflow. They have their own channels or sets of channels, and that's where they live as a team. So.
Hi, thanks. So how do you introduce a new member to your team? How, there's tons of information, right, in all of the channels, and how do you manage that and pass the information to new one?
Yeah, no, that's a great one. So we have a bunch of onboarding documentation that kind of describes where you want to go to read a lot of this information, stuff like our handbook. One of the things that we do too is we have a feature that's we can sync from LDAP. So when you get added into certain groups in LDAP, you get automatically added to a set of certain channels. So in our system, when you join as like a new staff member or a new person, when you get added into LDAP and then you get synced automatically to a whole bunch of channels, and then we have onboarding documentation that describes like, okay, in this channel you should go read about these things. In this channel you should go read about this thing. That's how we do it for staff members. If you're a community member, it actually happens in a little bit different way because you're not in our corporate LDAP system. You come in to our community server, community.mattermost.com, you sign up with it. We have a welcome bot that'll ask you a couple questions like, what are you interested in? Are you a developer? If you click yes, then it adds you to a bunch of developers channels. Are you interested in support? Yeah, I'm interested in support. It'll add you to a bunch of support channels. So it kind of depends on, that's kind of more unique to us being an open source project and having a large community. But what we find most customers, they'll do something like LDAP sync. So they'll sync from some system, and depending on some group structure in LDAP, you'll get added into certain channels. And then we have documentation to sort of describe what you should go read in those channels.
Right, and how you keep it up to date?
Yeah, so how we keep the documentation up to date, or yeah. So the documentation for us is living documentation. We're always submitting pull requests. So a great example is take like, let's say our handbook. Our handbook is all, because we're an open company, our handbook is actually all published online. So one of the things that we ask people to do is when you onboard, if you're reading through the documentation and you find something that's incorrect, you can go submit a pull request to modify that documentation and make it right. So we do a lot of stuff like that where when new people are coming on board, and we'll ask people for feedback too. Once they've kind of gone through the onboarding process, hey, is there anything we can improve? And people will make recommendations like, oh, it'd be nice if you could. That's where like Mentor for a Day come from. It'd be really nice if I could just meet somebody new every day, right? And so we implemented that. So the first 2 weeks you're at the company, you get to meet somebody new every day no matter what. And so we try really hard at building in those feedback loops.
Hello. Can you tell us a little bit about the recruiting process? How do you find the people remotely?
How do we find the people?
Yeah, how do you do the interviews? How do you identify that they have the same mission you do, the same culture, personal culture?
Yeah. So we're lucky, I guess we can cheat a little bit, being an open source project. Obviously, our open source contributors is our #1 place to identify these people. So they come to us already sort of with that mission-driven aspect of they want to work on our tool, they want to work on communication software, or they like our technology stack. So we're Go on the back end, we're React on the front end. So for us, that's a large part of sort of how we source these people. But in the beginning, it wasn't like that. In the beginning, it was a little bit different. We still use this process today. If you don't come from our community, we actually sponsor you or pay you to go work in our open source project. And it's one of the neat ways, it's one of the unique, novel things being an open source company you can do, is we can just have people come work for, let's say, whatever, so many hours. And it's a great way, it's a two-way street, right? It's a great way for that individual to experience how the company works. Because the reality is how you contribute to Mattermost, the open source project, is very similar to how an internal staff member works. And vice versa is true, right? As a company, it's a great way for us to test drive that individual as well. So for us, we have a very unique hiring process in the sense that, and it's all publicly documented. You can go Google Mattermost hiring process, where if you don't come from our community, so if you're not, someone who comes from our community, they're already intimately involved with us. A lot of our staff members already know that person. They've worked closely with that person. And so it's a little bit different process. But when you don't come from our community, you basically have a pre-screen or a phone screen. Then you might have an initial interview, and then you kind of go into what we call sponsor simulation or tryout. And that's just like, hey, work in our community. We'll pay you to work in our community. And then we'll have a couple follow-up culture screens from there. But we don't, like I said, our technical interview is basically go contribute to our open source project, or actually another open source project. So, if you don't want to contribute to Mattermost, that's fine too. Like, go contribute to something else. And that's kind of how we do it. So it's a little bit different. Like I said, it's unique or novel. So we have an advantage there being an open source project. But it's a great way to find very talented people, very mission-driven people who align to your sort of company culture.
How do you push, as in company-wide decisions? Say, for example, there's been a change in a deployment strategy and you need to push it out across, say, 5, 6 different teams. Like, how do you manage that?
Yeah, so we do everything through documentation. So if we have a change in strategy or a change in implementation, it's almost always documented somewhere, whether that be our handbook, whether it be our developer site for documentation. So we kind of take the tact or the attitude that it has to be publicly documented somewhere before it kind of becomes part of the process. So it's usually a multi-step process. The first one is go submit some documentation somewhere. For us, it's almost always public documentation. Like I said, we have very little private documentation in our company. It's almost always public documentation. So go submit some pull request somewhere that describes the new process you want. Get some feedback on if that's a process people want to adopt. If it's like an engineering specific feedback, we'll bring it, like someone might queue it up for what we call a dev meeting. So we have a weekly recurring, it's one of our few weekly recurring meetings. We have an engineering meeting every week. Anyone's actually allowed to join it. All the staff members are required, I shouldn't say required, are heavily influenced to join it, not required. People from the community are allowed to join it. It's an open meeting. We invite people from the community to join. We'll discuss that topic there. And if it's something we want to adopt, then we'll adopt it. And we might make an announcement back in the channel, or we might make an announcement at like a company all-hands meeting. Saying like, hey, here's this new process we're going to implement. By the way, go here to read the doc. Here's like the 30-second, too long didn't read, and by the way, here's the rich documentation of how that process works. So that's kind of how we all do it.
So how much of the time is consumed by the documentation itself? So to prepare it, to update it, and to read it, to consume it? More or less, how do you reckon?
Yeah, so I would say quite a bit. We're a really process-oriented company. That's probably more to do with our community than anything else. The community is an amazing superpower, but it's also, I describe it as like herding cats, right? To get everyone pointed in the right direction is a lot of work and energy sometimes. And the quickest way to get everyone pointed in the right direction, I think this is true irrespective of whether you're an open source company like us or not, is just through very powerful documentation. So we spend a lot of time in making sure we have the tooling to do it efficiently and the process to do it efficiently. So pretty much everything in our system goes through Git and GitHub. When you submit a pull request there, we auto-assign lots of times 2 reviewers, or you can choose your reviewers. And so it goes through that process of having, just like a code review, our documentation goes through the exact same process. Someone will submit a change to a documentation. 2 reviewers will get added, just like a code review. They'll approve that or reject that. They might add in other people, depending on what it is. We'll have a tech writer or someone from content who might actually review the PR just to make sure, like grammatically and structurally it's okay, and then someone else to review the raw content. But then once it gets accepted, it gets merged into the system, and then we have a whole bunch of tooling that once it's merged goes out and publishes it to the various different sites. Yeah.
So I'm very interested in the way that you have enabled that informal culture and that kind of water cooler and the kind of game that you're playing and things like that. I'm really interested in that. I've got a team that's spread across 10 locations, and I find that each group in each location, all the kind of collections of feature teams, they tend to do their own thing in their own location, but I think we're missing out on a big piece, which is learning across regions and across cultures. So I'm really interested to know more about how you've encouraged that, especially across time zones as well.
So so what we do is, like, let's take some of the examples, like we have our sort of audio chat hour. We actually schedule that in 2 different times. So we schedule, like, one is, at least in my time zone, it's like, 4 o'clock in the morning, and another one is at like 10 o'clock in the morning. So that way people in Europe have one that they can join, and people in America have one that they can join as well. So we try to do that. We have leadership at our company make a conscious effort of trying to join those meetings. So that way there's always some, not necessarily continuity, but if people have questions or you just want that ad hoc style of, like, I wouldn't quite call it an office hour, because an office hour to me is more intimate, like one-on-one kind of time. but just having other people there in the room can be an attractor. And sometimes it's forced. Like you'll see people in the channel like, hey, like I'm hanging out here all by myself, and other people are like, oh, okay, and they'll just go join in and stuff like that. But it takes a few individuals, and now we're a large enough company. We don't necessarily, someone will do it. In the early days, it was honestly just me. Like, hey, like I'm hanging out if anyone wants to chat, and there'd be days where I'd be hanging out by myself. But I think just getting that muscle memory of doing that like I said, we do it several times a week. We have the same thing with the gaming one. The gaming one's typically almost always on Friday. Sometimes they'll do 2 sessions, I think. I actually don't join them anymore. I'm so busy with other stuff. But like there's enough culture around people loving to do those things, and then there's enough other people in the team who've kind of picked up the charge of like, hey, we're gonna start gaming at 10 a.m. Like anyone wants to join, they'll just start posting in channel, and then it'll sort of groundswell from there. So those are the couple of the ways that we've done it. The social channels is another great one because like once you kind of get them started, you know, and they're the same kind of thing. Like it's really hard to create that. Like I thought it was really hard in the beginning to create that sort of open culture of like we have a social animals channel, right? And people in the beginning were kind of afraid to post pictures of their animal. Not afraid, but like I don't know how to describe it. You know, but once it kind of gets going and once you see other people doing it, it kind of sucks everyone else in. Like, oh, I got a stupid picture of my dog I can throw in there, stuff like that. And so, you know, it's really hard to get them established. And some of those social channels have taken a long time to get established. But once you have enough critical mass and once you have a few people in those channels who kind of nurture them and baby them, like the social animals channel is probably one of our most busiest. And you'll have people in there like on a Friday like, hey, I need somebody to post a picture of a cat for me because I just want to see a cat. So you get those people who will sort of instigate some of that social aspect of it. Whether it be the video games channel, like we have one called Analog Games, so board games and stuff like that. People will post pictures. We encourage people to post pictures of, you know, what they're playing and stuff like that. So it becomes we have another one, motorcycle channel or broom channel, I think they call it. So people who are into cars or motorcycles will post pictures of them doing Sunday drives and stuff like that. So it's stuff that you might talk about, you know, at a lunch table. For us, it started off as more, I would say, manufactured, but now it's become such a part of our culture that it doesn't feel manufactured anymore, if that makes sense. Like it started off with that very manufactured process of we just like kind of forced people to do it. And then it kind of evolved into where it just organically now it's large enough and big enough and there's enough people that care about it that it just kind of grows on its own. So. Any other questions? Nope. All right. I'll be up here. People have other questions.